Hey folks, hey folks, hey folks, hey folks. All right, let me get into some of your questions. I'm going to jump into things today. Really interesting week that we have had here. Let me start with a bunch of questions and try and pull them together. Hey folks, thanks for being here on this Thursday. Been quite a week, has it not? Been even more of the last 10 days or so. Remember, it was on the 15th, which was less than 2 weeks ago, that Trump met with Putin in Alaska. And that whole debacle, everything that's happened since has come since then, which is just crazy, the pace at which things are going. And it does look like everybody is here. We have Whitestone, Virginia. I've never heard about that. Hey, Pat from Maine. Why is it so freaking cold here? Gainesville, Florida. I bet it's not cold down there. Bozeman, Montana. I bought my cell phone, the cell phone I have in Bozeman, Montana last summer with this unbelievable guy helping me. He was fabulous. Lots of Maine, Columbus, Ohio. You know how I feel about Columbus, Beverly, Massachusetts, where some of Buddy's people went during the French and Indian War a long time ago. Astoria, Oregon, famous place. You know, someday I'm going to get a chance just to do state history, and I'm going to be such a happy little camper. Anyway, let me get into some of the questions that you had today. They're all over the map, but let me get rid of the easy ones first, and then we can talk more about the general picture of where we are. So a lot of people have asked about this, the stories you may or may not have seen about the fact that other countries starting tomorrow, actually they started a few days ago, but are not shipping products to the United States. And that is true. That is because there has been in U.S. tariff policy something called the de minimis exemption, which simply meant that if you were shipping something that was worth less than $800, it didn't have to go through the normal customs system for tariffs, because it just didn't seem like it would be worth it enough for the government to take a half a penny or whatever on a Christmas ornament that my sister sends me from Europe. So they exempted that traditionally, and Trump ended that exemption to go into effect tomorrow. And the reason I'm hesitating a little bit here is I did pull the numbers for you. The postal services across Europe, India, Japan, Australia, other countries as well, are going to or have stopped shipping most merchandise to the United States because that exemption ends tomorrow on Friday. The exemption has been there since 1938. And currently it makes up about $1.3 billion, billion packages worth more than $64 billion. And they are not shipping things simply because the US doesn't have any system to handle that many packages suddenly going into the system. And until that can be sorted out, they're not going to bother to send them, which makes sense, but it's going to mess up a whole bunch of things because, of course, it's about $64 billion worth of exchange. And it also is really isolates the US from the kind of ties that I just mentioned. The smaller things you send to people in other countries or they send to you. So it's really kind of a big shift. I assume it is one that the government will work out, simply because it's hard to imagine we're going to cut ourselves off that completely from the sort of familial connections, if not the trade connections, that these packages sent under the de minimis rule established. That being said, it has been clear for a while that there have been cases where actual manufacturers break stuff up so that they can send them under the de minimis rule without having to pay tariffs on them. And there was room for abuse in that. So perhaps they'll get that taken care of and get us back to being able to ship things back and forth. It is a little surprising how little coverage there has been of that. But there you have it. That is going into effect, and that is what it's about. All right. The other thing that you asked about, which I think takes me directly into the other stuff I wanted to talk about, is what is happening at the CDC. People have asked me about Trump's attempt to fire the one of the members of the board of governors of the Federal Reserve. I did talk about that on Tuesday, so I won't talk about that today. But yesterday, which I wrote about last night, there was an attempt on the part of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to get rid of the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We call it the CDC. The words "and prevention" are also there as well, but it goes by CDC. She was only confirmed in July, and he was angry because he wanted her to change the vaccine schedules for the coronavirus vaccine. And she said she would not do it without consulting other doctors. She's a doctor, he is not. And so he asked her to resign. When she refused to resign, he simply put on social media, on X, that she was no longer the director. Her lawyers stepped in at that point and said she has neither resigned nor been fired. And during that and after that, there was an exodus of a number of top leaders from the CDC saying that they could not work under Kennedy because he clearly was an ideologue who was destroying public health and scientific research. Now, that fight is playing out today. Kennedy is trying to put one of his lackeys in at the head of the CDC, but there has been a major walkout at the CDC of people cheering on those doctors and leaders who resigned over this issue. Now, one of the things that is interesting here is that if you recall, Kennedy barely got confirmed by the Senate and did so only when the senator from Louisiana, a doctor himself, Senator Cassidy, stepped up to the plate for him and said he had promised not to mess around with vaccine schedules, and he had promised not to do any of the things that he is now doing. Well, when the director of the CDC was under fire from Kennedy, she called Cassidy and he stepped in to tell Kennedy to back off, which is one of the things that infuriated Kennedy. It does suggest that there are Republican senators like Cassidy whose reputation is on the line over the Kennedy nomination and over the Kennedy confirmation, that they're mad about this. And they should be, because Americans are going to die because of the things that Kennedy is doing at the CDC and doing in all the different areas of American health. So that's what's going on right there. And the reason that I wanted to put that, first of all, was because I can read it in your messages, how frightened people are and how despairing they are. And I get it. Believe me, I get it. But the Trump administration's attempt to create a dictatorship here in the United States is not going very well. I mean, there are very public things we see. There are the ways in which the administration is trying to humiliate Americans by, for example, going into where the firefighters were fighting an active fire and demanding to see their IDs to make sure they were Americans, and then taking and arresting two of people who were allegedly undocumented immigrants who were fighting an active fire, and telling the people who said, "Can we say goodbye to them because we're like a family here?" Expletive off. We're gonna just do this. And there are many ways in which the administration is really trying to act as if it is Vladimir Putin's government in Russia or the dictatorial government in any number of places in the world. But so far, Americans are pushing back really powerfully. And what's happening at the CDC is an example of that. And I'm going to say more about that going forward, but you've heard about the purges at the CDC, and there is pushback against them. And there is at least a suggestion that these changes aren't going to stand. So I'm going to go with that for a little bit because I want to emphasize what I was talking about the other day with the Trump administration. I talked about it on Tuesday, but it bears repeating because I feel like people are afraid of a paper tiger, as they say. That is, Trump and his administration, and I do not believe he is the one calling the shots here. I believe that Stephen Miller, the deputy White House chief of staff, the person who is behind the massive deportations and is the absolute white nationalist, is behind them. And I believe Russell Vogt, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, who was a key architect of Project 2025, and who has been decimating the U.S. government in order to put in place a theocracy. Right now, it really looks like those two are the ones primarily calling the shots, which, just as a little bit of a side, is really interesting from a structural point of view. As I said to you months ago, power doesn't automatically vest in one spot or another. And there's been a lot of power sloshing around Washington, D.C. At first, it looked like Elon Musk was going to pick it up. It was pretty clear Trump didn't have a lot of it. Now it looks like Stephen Miller and Russell Vogt are the ones who are trying to grab hold of that power. But they are vulnerable because neither one of them is in an elected office. Neither one of them has their own power base, and they are dependent on President Donald Trump, who is himself a really loose cannon. So, and I've explained to you before what a loose cannon is. It's from the old days of warfare at sea, of naval warfare, when the cannons were chained to the deck because of the recoils. And if the chains snapped during that recoil of the cannon shooting off its cannonball, that cannon would ricochet around the internal pieces of the ship and destroy everything. This would just be an incredibly heavy piece of iron smashing around on everything. And so when you say somebody is a loose cannon, it really has this meaning of really being randomly destructive. And I think that really works in this case. But Trump is not in good shape. If you watch anything he does, he is very clearly a loose cannon. They are having to stroke his ego all the time. He is increasingly doubling down on the idea of sort of being a real estate mogul in Washington. There are many things that he is, as an individual, appears to be unable to handle in the White House, and instead is sort of ending up in a bubble that people are feeding in order to put in place an authoritarian government. And one of the things that I am not the only one watching very closely, but that I am watching very closely, are the ways in which the administration is trying to deploy the military. So you're seeing it in Washington, in DC, for example, but you are seeing it there picking up trash, for example, or mulching the trees in the tidal basin near the Jefferson Memorial, or near the Martin Luther King Jr. statue. And there is a sense that those military personnel are there to demonstrate that Trump and the MAGA Republicans control the Capitol. Now, remember, Congress is not currently in session. So you've got the president stamping control on the federal government. And yesterday, the Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, announced that the United States government would also take over Union Station. And Union Station is where the trains come and go, and where the metro trains run from. And it's also where the veterans have been protesting the Trump administration. The guy who burned a flag, he is part of the protests near Union Station. Just as an aside here, one of the best cup of coffees I've ever had was in Union Station last year. So if you're in the area, you might want to check it out. But anyway, that takeover of Union Station is important because that will control how people get into and get out of the city on the metro lines. And if you've noticed today, the Trump administration has made noises about taking over South Station in Boston, and not North Station. And that actually matters in Boston because South Station is the hub of the trains coming and going and the buses coming and going from Boston to the south. So that's sort of outward looking. North Station, which is actually not connected to South Station, which is a real nuisance when you live in the Boston area. But North Station is the opposite. It goes up to Maine. So nobody's talking about taking over North Station, which is where my heart is, because that's where my buses and trains tend to come and go from. But they're not. It's not nearly as well traveled as South Station. But there clearly seems to be a push to at least look as if the administration in the military is going to be in control of the train hubs in the east on the East Coast at least. And a lot of people go up and down that eastern corridor from Union Station to South Station. That is the Acela corridor, the Union corridor, the Union, I'm sorry, the Eastern corridor, and that is the most heavily trafficked part of the railroad lines in the United States. So that's a really ominous thing that they're talking about there. Trump is also talking about getting rid of mail-in voting. And that too is an interesting thing because actually we know that that both Republicans and Democrats use mail-in voting, and it's a very efficient way to vote. And a lot of countries do it. Trump says the U.S. is the only one who does it. That's simply wrong. A lot of countries do it, but it certainly could be read to suggest that he wants people to have to go to the polls in 2026 and then 2028, where he can station soldiers, which will, by definition, depress the vote. So certainly they are putting in place the tools to try to grab control of the 2026 vote. But here's the thing. Why oh, I'm sorry, one more thing on that. They are also trying to encourage people to fight for Trump in an election, and that's really pretty obvious today with the announcement that the administration has offered Ashley Babbitt, the former Air Force veteran who was killed at the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol when she tried to break into the chamber of the House of Representatives. She was shot by a police officer, and you can watch that video yourself. And the idea that she is somehow a martyr when she was breaking into a room where our elected representatives were cowering in fear of their lives is really a stretch. So you can see he's trying to encourage this idea, the idea that he pardoned or commuted the sentences of more than 1,500 of the people who were convicted or charged in the January 6th riots. He's clearly pushing this idea. But again, here's the point about that. Why does he need to do that? If he thought he could win those elections fairly, he wouldn't be trying to keep people away from voting. He wouldn't be trying to take control over the touch points in the city. He wouldn't be trying to find a way to station soldiers where people are voting. It's going to be really important to keep in mind that all of these machinations to try and cement the vote in 2026 is because Trump and the MAGA Republicans know that they are profoundly unpopular. And you know how you can tell this? Because in a special election on Tuesday in Iowa, and there was another one, there were a number of them, but there was also a big one in Georgia. In Iowa, a district that had gone for Trump in 2024 by, I think it was 11 points, flipped to a Democrat by 10 points. There was a 21% flip in a Republican district in Iowa, just 6 months, just less than a year after that election. So it's going to be really important to remember that the MAGA Republicans and Trump are deeply, profoundly unpopular. And the reason they're trying to cement their control of the government is because they know that people really, really, really don't like them. So how does this translate then to what we can do? That is, first of all, not to fight the administration on the military side in the streets, to give them an excuse to start to call for the insurrection, to invoke the Insurrection Act, or to do any of the military things that Trump is trying to set up, but to continue to fight this on a political level where they know they are losing. So what does that look like? First of all, that looks like making sure that elected representatives in your states, local governments as well, but in your states and the state houses, because this is where redistricting will take place, if there is such a thing, and in the national government, are more afraid of their voters, and I don't mean physically afraid. They are more concerned about making sure that those of us who care about democracy are answered than they are concerned about Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans. And you can see these shifts starting already. You are starting to see Republicans who are not MAGA, but even some of the MAGAs starting to back away from Trump's positions. Now, let me explain a little bit about, and you can look for this. It's not like I have some alchemy here. Take a look at how some of the people are responding to Trump's demands for a redistricting, for example, in Indiana. The Indiana Republicans don't want to do that. Take a look at whether or not Republican governors send National Guard troops to Trump's attempt wherever he does it. You'll see a number of Republican governors don't want to do that. Why don't they want to do that? They don't want to do it because they know that the National Guard system depends on states being able to help each other out. And by the way, well, I'll do that in a second. It depends on people being able to help each other out. And because here's the kicker. It is very clear that Donald Trump is not going to be here for the 2028 election. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe the gods will favor him and, drop fairy dust on him, but he is not going to be functioning in 2028 in such a way that he is going to help the MAGA Republican Party. And again, the tariffs haven't even really kicked in yet. So a lot of people are looking at the Republican Party under Donald Trump and they're backing away. Now I'm not saying they're abandoning him, but political people and business people are unsure which is going to be the successful place to be in the future. That's what they're trying to figure out. And they're dancing it right now. And you can see them doing it, and you'll see this in people being slow to commit troops, for example, being slow to introduce bills. They're stalling. They're waiting to see what happens, to see how long Trump's going to be around and whether he can turn around the fury of MAGA at him that has been building since early July and even since before that, over deportations, over the economy, and over now the fact that the administration says it will not release any more information about the Epstein files, even though we know that Trump is in them. That is still a real issue. It's still a real issue for MAGA, and it's going to become a bigger issue on September 3rd, the first day that Congress is back in session, when Democratic Representative Ro Khanna from California is working together with Representative Thomas Massie. Did I say a Republican for Khanna? He's a Democrat from California, is working with Republican Thomas Massie of Kentucky to interview victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell in front of Congress. That's going to put that story very much back in the news. And that Trump is extremely worried about that. But MAGA is also unhappy about something that Trump dropped very casually the other day in a meeting with the South Korean leader in the Oval Office. And it's listening to his press conferences and his press opportunities now is just like fingernails down a chalkboard. But because he no longer has even any kind of a filter, you hear a lot about what he's thinking about. That's been true for a while, but he just pops out with stuff now that's often a surprise. But if you hear about this stuff, one of the ways, here you go, let me tell you something. If you hear about this stuff and you want to check me, for example, or check anybody about what they say, the way you can do that is you can go to a YouTube channel that offers transcripts, and many of them do. You say you want transcripts, it's there under the little window, and then the transcript appears on the right-hand side. If you go to that transcript, you can then search the transcript for a keyword. So if you wanted to read the conversation that I'm about to tell you about, you can go to YouTube, you can look for Trump and South Korean leader. The video will come up and it goes on for a really long time. And normally you wouldn't listen to that because it's hours and you don't have that kind of time. Call up the transcript, search for what I'm going to tell you here, and you can read this exchange yourself. It's actually really quick once you start to do it. And if anybody's interested, by the way, I'm happy to do sort of a tutorial on how to get some of this information. People seem to think I read everything under the sun. I really just know how to do research. And once you know the shortcuts, it's a lot less onerous than you think it is. Anyway, he very casually dropped in that conversation that he wanted to start letting in 600,000 Chinese students to the United States of America. That's about twice as many who were studying in the United States before he got into office. And his sort of casual reasoning, as clear as it could be made out, was the reality that in the United States, because we have so dramatically cut funding for higher education, our higher education really depends on people from other countries coming to the US for college, for university, and for graduate school, because they pay, not always in graduate school, but for college and university. And the difference between a college and a university is a college does not have a graduate school and a university does, but both take undergraduates, the freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, that they have to pay full freight. They don't get the rake-offs that US citizens do. So foreign scholars essentially underwrite our higher education in the United States. And so he sort of very casually said, yeah, we should have these people come in again. Well, MAGA, if you remember, is all about discriminating against foreigners, especially foreigners that they don't consider white. So this lit MAGA's hair on fire, and it got almost no press because it's August and because people, I guess, just weren't paying attention to that particular comment, but MAGA sure was. So as I say, people are watching to see what's going to happen with MAGA and Trump and whether J.D. Vance, who is the heir presumptive because he's the vice president, can pick up those MAGA voters that Trump lost. And perhaps he will. It's not clear yet. He does not have the political skill that Donald Trump did, even though you can already see that Elon Musk, the billionaire who bankrolled Donald Trump's win in 2024, has backed off on his promise to create another political party and is instead now throwing his support behind J.D. Vance. And he's clearly going to try and buy him popularity. I can't imagine a more charmless politician than J.D. Vance. So whether he can pull it off or not is not clear. But what is clear is that there is still a great deal of slack in support for what Trump is doing and what the MAGA Republicans are doing, and pushing electeds, as they are called, to say, we care about democracy, we care about the Constitution, we care about the laws, we care about science, we care about vaccines. They do too. They just have been sucked into this idea that they've got to back Trump in order to get his voters. And that's going to be something, really, really important to hammer on. So a couple more things here. One, once again, to remind you that, again, people are looking at the deployment of the National Guard and at the deployment of certain military personnel to the cities to do Trump's bidding. Remember that they can't just walk away. They can refuse an unlawful order, but so far the administration has been very careful to couch their demands in orders that some of which are being challenged in the courts, but which look lawful. So don't assume that the National Guard or that the military wants to be there. I think it's going to be really important to remember and to reiterate that this movement that we are building is not about politics, and it's not about professions, and it's not about wealth, and it's not about any of the different markers that in the past have divided us along political lines. This is quite simply, are we going to lose our democracy to an authoritarian? And the people who don't want to lose it are not necessarily people that you ever expected to be on the same side as, let me put it that way, but they surprise you. One of the things that astonished me about my last book is that at the beginning of it, Bill Kristol, who was a neocon in the George W. Bush administration, has become really a far I mean, I guess you could call him center left, but you would not know it was the same man. He is really out front with progressive policies. And this is, again, the same thing we saw in the 1850s and the 1890s and the 1930s. Once people recognize that their democracy is in peril and come together, what comes out of that is never the same thing that went into it. So the example I always love is Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was a Democrat. He went into Lincoln's cabinet because he believed in democracy, and he did it out of a sense of duty. And if you looked at him in 1861, you would have thought that at the end of the war, he would have been somebody who, basically sided with the rest of the Democrats coming out of the war. And he was such a fervent Republican by the end of the war that when Lincoln was assassinated, he wandered around the streets sobbing to the point that people thought, his friends thought he'd had a mental break. So and yet, Salmon P. Chase, who was a fervent Republican in the early years, had been a Democrat before the war, but a fervent Republican, becomes a Democrat. So you just don't know whose alliances are going to hold coming out. And going forward, it's all hands on deck in this particular moment. And one of those critical things is going to be to try to remember that those people who are saying, oh, Trump has captured the military, are ceding the ground that we need. He has not captured the military. The military swears an oath not to do the sorts of things that he is asking them to do. And to remember that the American military still, anyway, appears to be acting in the defense of democracy. So one last thing on that is somebody said, again, what do you say when someone says we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic? The answer to that is the same as I always give, but I haven't done it in a long time, and I probably should do a short video on it. That's like saying, I don't have a dog, I have a golden retriever. A democracy and a constitutional republic are the same in that both of them are systems, and so is a representative democracy, are systems in which the people get to elect their representatives, either directly or through representatives. We get to be the ones who determine our government. A dictatorship is one in which one person rules over everybody and they have no say in who they elect. An oligarchy is when a group of people rule over the rest of people and have no say in who the oligarchs are. Now, the reason that people say this is not a democracy, this is a constitutional republic, is that actually comes in the 1950s from the John Birch Society, which was trying to make an argument for why Black Americans should not have the right to vote. And their answer was, this is not a democracy, it's a it's a constitutional republic, and they are virtually represented by the fact white people can vote. And, if anybody wants to stand on the John Birch Society right now, that's what they're up to, and they should know that. And you can call that out. So that actually brings up the last place I wanted to be, and that is this full-throated attack on American history and what America stands for. And the thing I want really to emphasize, there are two things I really want to emphasize, I guess three today. One is that the Trump administration is deliberately centering the ideology that the Confederacy embraced in the 1850s and the 1860s. The idea that some people are better than others and have the right to rule. And those few people tend to be white and male, and they are more qualified than Black Americans, brown Americans, people of color, and women are to have a say in their society and to determine their own fate. And that is what the administration is trying to do with its attacks on U.S. history. But the second point I want to make is that one of the things that scholars of Black American history talk about is how Black history is American history. And a lot of people, when they hear that, make the mistake, I think, of thinking that that's sort of a way of saying, well, of course, Black Americans were here too. But that's not really what they're saying. What they're saying is that the central theme of Black history, and I would add women's history, and I would argue any marginalized history, is really the central theme of American history in a way that the history that Donald Trump is pushing is not. And what I mean by that is that democracy in the United States has always been the effort of those people who were excluded from it to be included. So we understand attacks on our rights. We understand how hard it is to protect those rights. We understand creating movements of solidarity to expand those rights. We understand how important it is to vote. We understand how important it is for us to be included in our government. And that's the theme of American democracy itself. So when Trump makes war on Black history or women's history or Chicano history, or any of the many different kinds of history, what he is really doing is stripping away democracy in favor of either that oligarchy that the 1850s Southern elite enslavers wanted to put in place, or of a dictatorship that says your struggles to be included in our country are not part of our story. The only story is that of elite white men like me. So that's the other piece I wanted to talk about today. And the third piece is, to me, obvious. A lot of you write to me a lot of the time and say, what are we going to do now that Trump is attacking our history? And the answer to that seems to me so simple. We learn it ourselves. And I don't mean you suddenly have to disappear in a library and start from scratch. I mean, you tell your children the stories of your life and about the people that you care about and the things that they did. And it does not have to be, storming the beaches of Normandy. It can simply be starting a food bank that made a difference to a community. Or it can be something like happening to have listened on the radio to a really important speech. If you note, I always talk about important speeches. I did that with J.B. Pritzker's speech the other day, even though it was quite late at night. And the reason for that is because my mother had diphtheria when she was a child in the 30s and got stuck at home with nothing to do but read and listen to the radio because her family was quarantined forever. And on the radio, she used to listen to Hitler's speeches. She didn't speak a word of German. So she didn't know what the words were, but she could tell that the cadence and the screaming that he was engendering was boding something terrible for the world. And as soon as she was old enough, she joined the army. So those sorts of stories matter. But if you go beyond that even and you talk about the stories that matter to you, the stories that matter to your community, the books that you read, that's how we keep the real history alive, even if we had somebody running the White House who thought the things I think about are important. Those are the ways we keep history alive, because all history is the story of who we are and how we have changed society to make it just a little bit better. And if we do that, the fact that he wants to have that garden of heroes of sculptures and all that, fine. Go, don't go, read about the people in it, don't read about the people in it. What really matters is that we preserve our history. And our history, regardless of where you fall in race or gender or age or anything, it matters that we know the stories of those people who, when forced out of participation in American society, found ways to force their inclusion in it. Because at the end of the day, that is literally what American democracy is about for all of us, especially in this moment when people are trying to strip that away from so many of us. So what can you do? I mean, there, first of all, is a bit of a walking paper. Read about history. And I'm doing my part over here, and I'm trying to make it as palatable as possible. But, talk to your kids and your grandkids and, your neighbor kids about what life was like when you were a kid. They like it. They're interested in that. Maybe not when they're teenagers, but a little bit later and a little bit earlier, they definitely are. But also remember all the ways in which you can push back against this current administration. 5 calls, and I've been sharing things online for ways to build community, food banks, driving people to and from doctor's appointments, all the different ways that you can build community, but also making sure that your representatives, elected representatives, hear from you about the things that you're concerned about. Phone calls really matter. Showing up at town halls really matters. Showing up at school board meetings, showing up at town offices, all of those things matter. So does, of course, making sure that the electeds in Washington understand what's important to you. So does being on social media and spreading your stories about, this We Are America thing appears to be taking off. I Am an American thing is taking off. Somebody, and I will write to you if you're listening, today just sent me some spectacular posters. Make your voice heard and what you care about known, because the more that we do that, we're not just pushing back against the Trump administration. We are building a new kind of future, a new kind of community to reach forward into the future. And I sort of feel as if, and this is a feeling, like I say, and it could 1,000% be wrong, but it feels increasingly to me like Trump and the MAGA Republicans we're moving kind of beyond them. And what comes next, I don't know. People keep saying to me, "Why aren't the Democrats doing anything?" I promise you the Democrats are doing tons of stuff. If you're in the States and you're a Democrat, you've got an issue because you're trying not to make Trump and the MAGA Republicans angry because you're afraid you're gonna lose state funding. That's a really big deal, both for Republican governors and for Democratic governors. They're trying to find ways to resist without calling attention that would hurt their constituents. But they're also not in session right now in Washington, so it's a little harder to make a big statement. But that being said, I really feel like the movement has shifted to us. Nobody's going to save us. This is about us. And when you look at the many different ways that pressure from constituents is forcing somebody like California Governor Gavin Newsom to step up and take a stand, he didn't suddenly wake up one morning and say, "I've got a great idea." He had slid a little bit too close to the right wing bros and got such pushback. He went this direction, is getting a ton of positive reinforcement, and now is a real figure pushing back at the Trump administration. Pritzker was out there a little bit early, but certainly when he gets positive reinforcement, he does the same thing. Van Hollen from Maryland. There are many, many different people who are leaning into the role of representing the American people in this moment to help us move beyond where we have been. And they're doing it because of us. Your voice really matters. So let's keep it up. And I will tell you, speaking of history, I hope, you can never tell because this happened to me the other night when I had a history letter ready to go, and then Pritzker gave a speech, and whoop, there went my history letter. I've got a letter tonight. I'm halfway through it that I'm so excited about. It's about the Chicano movement, which has always fascinated me as an intellectual movement. And you're probably going to learn something that you didn't know before. And I hope it's the sort of thing that makes you think, how on earth did I live to be X years old and not have any idea about the Chicano movement? So you can look forward to that. And once again, I keep forgetting to tell this to people. You can find letters that I write every night about politics and history for free. They're letters from an American. My name is Heather Cox Richardson, and you can have them delivered to your inbox from Substack. Again, just don't put in your credit card, or you can read them on Facebook. And similarly, some of you are watching on YouTube, but for those of you who don't know, I do have a YouTube channel that is where I put a lot of my history videos and these videos and the interviews that I have been doing with people that I find interesting. It's a little bit eclectic, but what I'm trying to do is demystify our government and talk to people that I think might have interesting things to say about where the United States is going and how we should understand that. Anyway, everything is out there, and you are always welcome because I think we're building a great community. All right, thank you for being here, and with luck, I will get this Chicano movement letter written and I will see you again. I don't know when. Today is Thursday, at least by next Tuesday. Thanks for being here.